Before we get started this morning, I want to thank all of our guys who filled in for me while I've had a rough couple of weeks. I appreciate it. First it was my oral tooth situation, and then it was COVID and strep, and fortunately I am feeling better, but it's so wonderful and such a blessing to have some guys who can step in and teach class and preach sermons and so forth, and I really do appreciate our guys being willing and able to do that for us, and I hope we're all appreciative and let them know how much we appreciate them as well. A couple of weeks ago, we started what I called a little mini-series of sermons talking about the power of God, not necessarily looking at every single example of a miracle over nature necessarily, but specifically from the Old Testament, and looking at maybe accounts that we don't really spend a lot of time on during our maybe week-to-week sermons or week-to-week Bible studies, examples of God's power over nature. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at a couple of situations where God separated the waters. For instance, certainly the one we commonly think of is the one at the Red Sea, where the children of Israel crossed over and the Egyptian army was drowned in the sea. But then, of course, there was also the example of Israel crossing the Jordan into Canaan with Joshua. And then there was also Elisha and Elijah, who also separated the Jordan, or through the power of God, the Jordan was separated to allow them to pass as well. And I'd like to consider with you this morning another example of God's power. And in this particular situation, or situations, there's two of them we're going to look at this morning. It's God's power over the day and over the night. And in particular, I want you to consider with me, where the first one we're going to look at is in Joshua chapter 10. And we're going to start in verse 1, but kind of a little bit of a lead up to it. A couple of weeks ago, we were studying, well, it's been several weeks ago now, we studying regarding Balak and Balaam. And we noticed in Numbers, starting in Numbers chapter 21 and 22 and going forward for the next couple of chapters, Israel had gone up and defeated the Amorites, namely Og and Sihon, two kings of the Amorites. But there were 7 kings of the Amorites total. And by kings, these were basically kings over city-states. Okay, they were kings over individual cities that had land that was kind of surrounding those cities. And so that's why there were multiple kings of the Amorites. And there's at least 7 of them that we know about for sure. And the first 2 were on the east side of the Jordan. Those were the ones in Numbers chapter 21. In fact, they're specifically named at the end of Numbers 21 as Israel destroying Og and Sihon and taking both of their kingdoms, their cities there. But then after they crossed over Jordan, remember they took Jericho, Israel did. Then eventually, after some situations with Achan, they took the city of Ai. And after that, there was a lot of fear in the region of Canaan, and in particularly among the Amorites. And in fact, here's a map of some of the cities that we're talking about this morning. Primarily, we're going to be talking about, here's Jericho, here's Ai, and here's Gilgal. Now, if you remember, as we looked at a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the separating of the Jordan as Israel crossed over and Joshua and so forth, they made camp after they crossed the Jordan at Gilgal. That was kind of the headquarters for Israel there for a period of time as they were starting to take out a lot of the tribes in Canaan. But we have Jericho here, we have Ai here, but some of the ones that we're going to note this morning is the city of Gibeon. And then to the south, we have Jerusalem, and further south, we have the other 4 cities that are going to be represented here of the Amorites. So starting in Joshua chapter 10 and in verse 1, we're told it came to pass when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel, and were among them. In fact, Gibeon, as we're told later on here in chapter 10, is going to be the only city-state that is going to join Israel and make peace with Israel and kind of have this, I guess you could call it an alliance. All the rest of Canaan are going to fight against Israel. Gibeon's the only one who isn't. And Gibeon, we're told in verse 2, that they feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all of its men were mighty. Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoham, king of Hebron, Purim, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Deber, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon. For it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel. Therefore, the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered together and went up, they and all their armies, encamped before Gibeon and made war against it. So because Gibeon has joined the Israelites, these 5 kings, along with their armies, have decided to go up and take Gibeon, destroy Gibeon. Gibeon was a foothold, particularly here in the south, where the rest of the Amorites are. And because Gibeon is right there along that border, that was a strategically important place. And so these 5 armies decided they were going to take Gibeon and try to keep Israel there on the east side of that Jordan there. Now, what we're going to find as we go forward here in verse 6, that Gibeon then sends message to Joshua. And they tell Joshua, listen, we entered into an alliance, and the 5 kings of the Amorites have come with their 5 armies, and they're going to take our city. We see in verse 6 that they sent a message to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, saying, Do not forsake your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered together against us. So, Joshua, knowing that this city had joined them, they were basically allies, Joshua is certainly keen to make sure that he takes care of Gibeon. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And in verse 8, the Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you. Now, what's interesting about this particular account is we've got these 5 kings of the Amorites going to attack the city. But what Joshua does, and of course, a lot can be said about Joshua's military prowess. Okay, he's a really wise general, I guess you could call him, and obviously some of that may have come from wisdom from God, but Joshua had a keen mind when it came to military. Notice what happens in verse 9. Joshua therefore came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. And what sounds like happens is Joshua is planning an ambush. He wants to make it so that these 5 armies have no idea that they're coming. Okay, he doesn't want them to know. So they march all night, and it says he came upon them suddenly, which suggests that it was a quick strike. It was an ambush. And in verse 10, we find the Lord routed them before Israel, killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the road that goes to Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And it happened, verse 11, as they fled before Israel and were on the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down large hailstones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than the children of Israel killed with the sword. So we see God fulfilling his promise, as he told Joshua, not a man among them will be able to stand before you. Well, they're running, okay? They're fleeing from this initial battle, and then God sends hailstones on those who are fleeing and kills more in that hailstorm than what Israel had killed with the sword. But there's still a great number. Remember, there's 5 armies encamped here at Gibeon. So there's a lot, and we're not told exactly how many soldiers there are, but there are a lot. Well, notice what Joshua says in verse 12. Because what's interesting here is this is the day that the sun and the moon stood still. Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said, in the sight of Israel, Sun stands still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there has been no day like that, before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. I think it's really interesting how this is worded here. In verse 12 and 13, we see Joshua, and I suggest that he's making a request. Joshua is not commanding this. He has no authority or ability for this on his own. But it's in essence a request to God. And it serves a very specific purpose. Because I suggest that during the course of this event, this battle, okay, there's several hours have taken place. They attacked maybe before day broke or right after daybreak. They had marched all night, and certainly they came upon them suddenly. So it suggests that they started in the early morning attacking these 5 armies. But then over the course of the day, they're winning the battle. Now they're trying to retreat. Hailstorms are falling. But as it gets later in the day, it's clear that they're going to run out of daylight to chase down all of these soldiers from these 5 armies. And so Joshua's request serves a very important purpose, which is we need daylight to be able to track down all of these soldiers who are fleeing. In fact, we're told, as we see here in verse 13, the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the people had revenge upon their enemies. That suggests that that's the purpose for having the sun stand still in the sky, to allow daylight to continue until they had tracked down all 5 armies and destroyed them. And ultimately, after this event, the 5 kings who tried to hide in a cave, ultimately they're killed as well. But I think it's an incredible event because what happens here, we're told in verse 13, it did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Now, commentators are kind of split on exactly what this means, whether it means a whole day as in 24-hour day, or it means a whole period in which daylight normally would have existed, which would have been 12 hours. But regardless, you have a period of time in which this day seemed to go on and go on and go on and go on. And God, for Israel's sake, and remember what did Joshua say back in verse 12? He said this in the presence of all of Israel. He says, sun stand still over Gibeon, moon, the valley of Ajalon. So both the sun and the moon stand still. But then as we see in verse 14, there has been no day like that, before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man. Now, certainly, we can bring up situations like Elijah, who prayed that it wouldn't rain, and it didn't rain for 3 years and 6 months, then he prays again, and it rains. I tend to think, and certainly this, obviously Elijah came much later than this, but I tend to think of this from the perspective of God heeding the request of an individual to stop the sun and moon in their tracks. That nothing like that had ever happened before, and at the very least until this point, will never happen again. Whether or not God ever did it again because of a request, may not have been recorded for us, but at the very least, Joshua was the only one we know of who made this request to God, and God heeded it. And what are we told at the end of verse 14? For the Lord fought for Israel. That's why. God made a promise. He guaranteed that they would be able to destroy their enemies. Joshua requests extra time to be able to track everybody down so nobody can escape. God answers that request, gives them that time, because God fought for Israel. And then in verse 15 we see, then Joshua returned and all Israel with him to the camp at Gilgal. So having destroyed all 5 armies, they return. But what I think is interesting about this, of course, last time, a couple weeks ago, when we talked about the parting of the seas, there were a couple of artist renditions of kind of the imagination of what that may have looked like. having the sea up so high above the heads of the children of Israel, these walls of water around them, of imagining a dry riverbed of the Jordan. Remember, it was 20 miles upstream that God caused a wall to form of water holding up the Jordan. What those things may have looked like. This isn't necessarily a majestical scene per se. It's just the day just pauses, and it seems to last far longer than it ought to, for at least 12 up to 24 hours longer than it should have. Not necessarily a observable, majestic display of God's power, and yet, what a wonderful show of power from God, that his power isn't just limited to terrestrial things. It's not limited to just parting of seas, but that however he accomplished this, whether he stopped the rotation of the earth or he caused the sun and the moon to be in that same position as it was, however he did it, that God caused this to happen. And as far as we know, this specific type of situation never happened again. However, there is one more time where something similar does take place. In 2 Kings chapter 20, 2 Kings chapter 20, we have a situation with King Hezekiah. 2 Kings chapter 20, there is a parallel record in Isaiah chapter 38 as well, that has everything that's recorded in 2 Kings is also recorded in Isaiah, but there's a little bit more detail here in 2 Kings, which is why we're going with the 2 Kings account. In 2 Kings chapter 20, starting in verse 1, in those days Hezekiah was sick and near death. And Isaiah the prophet, son of Amoz, went to him and said, "Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live." Now, we're told later on in verse 7 that he has a boil of some sort that apparently has become infected, and that's what is prompting this situation where he's going to die. In verse 2, Hezekiah, he turns his face toward the wall and prays to the Lord. And he says in verse 3, "Remember now, O Lord, I pray, how I have walked before you in truth and with a loyal heart, and have done what was good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. I do think it's interesting that Hezekiah doesn't make any request of God other than, "Remember now, O Lord." That's his only request, is remember what I've done. Remember the way I've served you. That's the only thing he says. He doesn't say, "Lord, please heal me of this," or anything like that. But in verse 4, we see how God responds. God doesn't respond directly to Hezekiah. Instead, starting in verse 4, he responds through Isaiah. "It happened before Isaiah had gone out into the middle court, that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, 'Return and tell Hezekiah, the leader of my people, thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears, surely I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of the Lord. And I will add to your days 15 years. And I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. And I will defend this city for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David." I do think it's notable he doesn't say, "for your sake, Hezekiah." He doesn't say that. He says, "I will defend this city for my own sake and for the sake of David." Not necessarily for Hezekiah. But what he says is, first of all, I'm going to heal you. And on the third day, you're going to go up to the temple. You're going to go up to the house of the Lord. And I'm going to give you 15 more years to your life. Now, that's not like he's going to live to 150, but it's 15 more years rather than dying perhaps that day or the next day from this situation. In verse 7, Isaiah said, "Take a lump of figs." So they took and laid it on the boil, and he recovered. So this is where we find what seems to be the preemptive issue here that's causing, or would have caused, the death of Hezekiah, was a boil that perhaps had become infected. And yet through Isaiah, the lump of figs didn't do anything. It was the power of God that healed him, because God says, I will heal you. But what we have here in verse 8, remember, God made this promise to Hezekiah. Hezekiah said to Isaiah, what is the sign that the Lord will heal me, and that I shall go up to the house of the Lord the third day? Kind of similar to other situations we've seen in the Old Testament, where signs were requested, signs were given. We have Gideon, certainly is one example of that, who needed reassurance of certain events that God said were going to happen. Well, here in verse 9, Isaiah said, this is the sign to you from the Lord, that the Lord will do the thing which he has spoken. But then notice he gives Hezekiah the option. He gives him a choice. Shall the shadow of the sun go forward 10 degrees or go backward 10 degrees? Now, this is regarding the sundial of Ahaz. And this is also mentioned in Isaiah chapter 38 as well. But shall the shadow of the sun that's on the sundial represents 180 degrees, shall the shadow go forward 10 degrees or go backward 10 degrees? Hezekiah, verse 10, I think it's interesting what he says. It's an easy thing for the shadow to go down or forward 10 degrees. Well, he says it's an easy thing. Obviously, the sun's going to go down anyway. Okay, that's not necessarily a sign if the sun's going to go down 10 degrees in an hour anyway. But he says, let the shadow go backward 10 degrees. That would definitely be an observable suspension of natural law, because the sun can't go backwards in the sky. It only goes forwards. Time only moves forward. He requests that the shadow of the sun go backward. So, verse 11, Isaiah the prophet cried out to the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down on the sundial of Ahaz. And that was to Hezekiah the sign that God would fulfill everything he said, that he would heal him, he would get to go to the temple on the third day, and that 15 years would be added to his life. Now, if you're like me and you were like, 10 degrees? That doesn't seem like a lot. Well, 10 degrees may not necessarily be a lot, but it ends up being about 40 minutes. So the day, in essence, was extended for 40 minutes in this situation, because especially, and there's some commentaries that suggest that maybe at this point the sun had almost set. So the whole sundial may have been covered in shadow at this point, for the sun to come back up, to have that obvious effect of showing the sun going backward. Whether or not that's the case, regardless, the sun did go backward 10 degrees or 40 minutes on this day. Now again, it's a little bit different than what happened with Joshua, where God made, in essence, time stand still. The sun and the moon stood still for up to 24 hours. But in this case, God actually moved the sun back 40 minutes. An incredible thing. And we're not told what the response or reaction of Hezekiah is. Obviously, it was meant to assure him that God would do what he said. But what an incredible event to witness. What an incredible thing to see the sun move back up 40 minutes. And especially picture yourself at a sunset. The sun's maybe not quite below the horizon, and all of a sudden that sun moved back up by 40 minutes. How weird, how strange. And talk about an observable suspension of natural law. That's what God did. Now, what's interesting about both of these events, there are several stories that have been told for about 150 years or so at this point regarding both of these events. And in fact, I remember growing up, and I have no idea where I heard it from first, but I remember hearing this story. In fact, when I was preparing this lesson, I intended to present this evidence that scientists supposedly had been able to go back and through the timeline and so forth, scientifically, through astrophysics and so forth, show a missing 24 hours. And to show in that process the missing day of Joshua, or the long day of Joshua, and the 40 minutes that went backward. But despite having heard that before, and despite there being a lot on the internet claiming that, that's actually not true. It started back in the late 1800s. There was a claim by a fella, and I won't go through the process. This is what the bulletin article is about. It goes through, talks about these stories and whatnot. Despite the claims that this fella had of going back through the process, his methodology was flawed, his science was wrong, and so forth. Scientists have not discovered a quote-unquote lost day. However, one of the reasons why it may have come up, especially in the last couple dozen years or so, is that back in the early 2000s, the Cambridge scientists claimed to have found evidence of this event. What they said, they went back to the Hebrew that's recorded, particularly in Joshua, and they said, well, this event, we can reinterpret these terms in the Hebrew to actually be representing an eclipse. And so they went back to, in their star charts, and they were able to say, we think that there was an annular eclipse during this period of time. So that must be what's being described, is that when it says it stood still in the day, was the fact that the sun and the moon, actually the moon covered the sun, and what's being described is just an eclipse. Now, there's two problems, obviously, that I have with what that claim is. First of all, it completely negates any possibility of the power of God doing what he said he did. The Bible tells us that Joshua made this request, and God made the sun stop for up to 24 hours. Basically, this is reinterpreting miracles to make it not a miracle. But second of all, what happens in an eclipse? It becomes dark, doesn't it? An annular eclipse may not be as dark, called the ring of fire, but it still becomes darker. Whereas the entire purpose of what God did back in Joshua chapter 10 was to provide light for the children of Israel to defeat the armies of the Amorites. So an eclipse would not serve the purpose in the context of what's happening, much less the elimination of the power of God. But I bring those situations up because there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of stories out there about this stuff. But what is really interesting, and I even mentioned this in the bulletin article as well, is that there are records in ancient history about a long day. There was a Emperor Yao in Chinese records who his reign was during the time that Joshua and the children of Israel were going through Canaan, and historians record that of a long day. The same thing is recorded among the Egyptian priests of a long day. And there's even the Aztecs, the Peruvians, and the Babylonians record of a day of twice its natural length taking place at this same time. Now, it's interesting that we read Joshua chapter 10, for instance, and we think of it locally. We think of it in the situation of the context, which is Israel against the Amorites. But the fact of the matter is, given how our ancient ancestors were obsessed with the stars, they were obsessed with the sun and the moon, do you think that an abnormally long day would have gone unnoticed? No, not a chance. The fact that there are records of a strangely long day that should not be that long, it's abnormal, one might say supernatural, literally, because it shouldn't be that long. A lot of times we think about it in terms of Israel and Joshua and the Amorites, but everybody else in the world experienced this as well. It was abnormally long. And what's interesting about this is going back to the Psalms, as we did last week, turn back with me to Psalm 74, is that with this, or both of these examples, where God shows power over celestial bodies, over the sun itself, which is a star. However, whatever he did, however he used his power to bring these events about, shows he has mastery over his creation. In Psalm 74 and in verse 12. Remember I said to keep this passage in mind because our third and final sermon is actually going to be focused here as well. But we only read a couple of verses here. We're going to read an extra verse now. Starting in verse 12, the psalmist says, "For God is my king from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces. You gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. You broke open the fountain and the flood. You dried up mighty rivers." Now we talked about the separating of the sea, the separating of the Jordan. Now notice the next verse, verse 16. "The day is yours. The night also is yours. You have prepared the light and the sun." Events like this recorded in the Old Testament remind us that God is master over his creation. Nothing has changed. It's been thousands of years since the Red Sea and the rivers of Jordan were parted. It has been thousands of years since Joshua requested that the sun stand still, or that Hezekiah was given the sign and the sun went backward 40 minutes. But God hasn't changed. His power hasn't ebbed. He's still master over his creation. And the final point I want to leave with you this morning is in Psalm 78. Again, another passage we read the last time we discussed this topic. But I want to read it again and re-emphasize the points that are made, starting in verse 1. "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children." Last time we were applying this just with the separation of the waters of the Red Sea and the waters of the River Jordan. But now we include in these wonderful, great works of God the stopping of the sun and moon, even moving the sun backward in its arc. But then verse 7. Not only do we remain mindful of these great, powerful works that God has shown, we teach them to our children, so that, verse 7, they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. This is why we go through accounts in the Old Testament of the flood, events including the parting of the Red Sea, the cessation of the traveling of the sun and the moon in the sky, to remind ourselves and our children of the works of God, and that he's still there, he's still watching. Nothing escapes his attention. He hasn't turned his back on his creation, and he hasn't turned his back on his people. He is still there, and he still has given us promises. Just as he gave Israel promises, just as he gave Hezekiah a promise, well, he, through Jesus, has given us a promise. He will never leave us nor forsake us, as the Hebrew writer tells us. So we must continue in faith and set our hope in God and keep his commandments. We offer an invitation this morning to those who are not Christians. You have an opportunity this morning to set your hope in God. to be baptized, to have your sins washed away, to keep the commandments of the Lord. And from that point on, having hope, having true hope, that no matter what happens in this world, no matter how bad things get in our society, in the world, that we can have peace, knowing that the worst that can happen in this life is that we die. That's the worst thing that can happen. But God will take care of our soul. Those of us who are Christians. Verse 7 is a crucial verse in the broader context of recognizing, as the psalmist does, how Israel turned away from God, how they forgot the mighty works of Jehovah, how they didn't maintain their hope. This was issued at this time to Israel as a warning. And we need to take that warning to heart as well. As Paul points out in 1 Corinthians 10, all those things that happened to Israel happened to them as a warning for you and for me, that we don't make the same mistakes. Will you examine your soul this morning? If you need help in any way, come forward as we stand and sing.